The biggest myth that TV and movies show about the Russian Mafia is they shoot first and ask questions later. And none of that is true. I'm Joe Serio. I was the only American to work in the Organized Crime Control Department of the Soviet National Police. Later, I investigated the Russian Mafia, and I worked for the CIA for 5 years. Today, we'll be looking at Russian Mafia scenes in TV and movies and judge how real they are. You see the gangsters, the mafia, walking into a restaurant in London. So when you talk about Russian Mafia and you talk about the expansion, these guys, number one, are all over the world. One of their main hubs is London. They bought up tons and tons of real estate in order to launder their funds from Russia. They frequently, both in the Soviet era and in the Russian era, they used restaurants as meeting places. And so you see them walking into a restaurant in London. Pretty normal, pretty typical.
Судя по твоим напорёгам, видно, что ты сидел в Сибири. Так?
They did a really good job with this scene. The thing about the Russian underworld is they have such extensive tattooing. The first comment that the boss makes, I can see from your look that you did time in Siberia. The tattoos will tell you where you stand in the hierarchy. They'll tell you what crimes you committed, how many sentences that you served in the prisons. The other thing about this clip is Nikolai is in a coronation ceremony. That's what's happening here. He's being made a thief with a capital T. They call it the Vori v Zakoni. That's the thief in law. Those are the big bosses, the chiefs of the mafia world. So this whole section about, I did a couple of years in solitary confinement. I was in prison. The thing about the Vori, the thieves, is that traditionally, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, their respect and their elite status came from how long they did in prison. So one of the things I was involved in was getting inside Russian prisons and shot documentaries. And one prison I went into, we went to see one of these thieves. The warden said to me, look, I'm not going to lie to you. This guy that we're about to meet, he controls this prison. He's the one that keeps the peace. I have to work with him.
Поэтому свободное место на твоей груди, на коленях.
In this scene, they're talking about stars, and Nikolai is about to get his tattoos as an underworld thief. One, you already see the cross on Nikolai's chest. That's one that's used a lot by bosses, but the stars is the thing. The stars is the most well-known. And he says in the scene, you have an empty space on your shoulders, that's where the stars are going to go. And the stars on your knees say, I will not genuflect, I will not kneel before any authority. I'm a boss. I'm not a huge fan of this scene. Bathhouses generally were places of safety where guys could gather. And generally speaking, they were off limits to things like this. That knife itself, in Russia, you use whatever weapon you use. So at some point in the Soviet Union, it was said that the most commonly used weapon in a murder, and not mafia, just among citizens, was an axe. Because if you think about Russia prior to the Soviet Union, it was a very agricultural country. So this weapon isn't necessarily like a signature of the Russian Mafia. It was what this guy had handy. First of all, Viggo Mortensen is professional's professional as an actor. And he did a great job here, learning the language, the scene in London, the coronation, you know, the tattoos and the descriptions of the tattoos and all that. 9 out of 10 on this scene.
So I stole a car.
It's John Wick. We called him Baba Yaga.
The boogeyman?
They steal his car. John's getting more and more pissed off. And the climax is when the father gangster says, look, you don't know who you're dealing with. This is the boogeyman. So Baba Yaga comes from folklore where Baba is grandmother. The main story is Baba Yaga was a witch who would kidnap, murder, and eat children. Okay, there are a lot of different versions of what Baba Yaga was. Some she was terrible, some she was good. So in terms of Russian mafia, like this isn't really that realistic, but from the folklore perspective, and he's going to be worse than the worst witch of Russian Ukrainian folklore.
He was the one you sent to kill the boogeyman.
This idea of a Russian hitman, a Russian assassin, totally realistic. Maybe not quite as many bodies dropping in a 5-minute period as John Wick, but there were so many assassinations, hundreds, done by hitmen in the 1990s and the 2000s. If you look at someone like Alexander Solonik was the biggest name in Russian underworld as an assassin. This idea of there being Russian hitmen, they had their role to play and they played it really well. Casinos and nightclubs were some of the central hubs for Russian mafia. In the 1990s, when the Russian mafia on the street was really big, you would have shootouts all the time. You'd have shootouts in nightclubs, shootouts on the street. I could hear gunshots on a regular basis. There was one situation we had where we found a trunk full of weapons in one car in the parking lot of a nightclub. The biggest myth that TV and movies show about the Russian mafia is they shoot first and ask questions later. And none of that is true. They would start with negotiation, but if it got to the point where they couldn't reach agreement, they would have shootouts. And if you look at hitman, revenge motive, shootouts in nightclubs or bathhouses or anything like that, that's accurate. I give it about a 7 out of 10.
You must be Betty. I'm no cocaine. Trust of Flight was good, no?
Obviously, it's a comedy, so most of the stuff would never happen. But interesting use of the Chechens because you don't see them as a main character of TV shows very often. They have a reputation for being particularly violent, for being great with weapons and hitmen and all that. And in 1991, I worked with the police. The Chechens were up and coming, and they were flooding Moscow. And they took just a disproportionate amount of power and influence over Moscow and other parts of the Soviet Union in the underworld. We use this phrase, Russian Mafia, Russian Mafia. They're multicultural. There are Russian groups, Chechen groups, there are Armenian groups, Azerbaijani groups. So there's all kinds of ethnicities, and that's understandable because the former Soviet Union has more than 100 ethnic groups in it.
This is Ryan Madison. He's a physical trainer. You guys want him gone? Yes. Good. Okay.
So one of the things you see is these guys are talking to Barry to be a hitman. Why wouldn't they use their own guy? Not just the Chechens. There was a lot of outsourcing generally in the Soviet Union. So if Barry gets caught, he's not a Chechen. So the investigators, the detectives, the police won't look immediately to us.
The LA operation is going super great. Now, I know there's still some small reservation about teaming up with traditional enemies, the Bolivians.
So people may find this idea of collaboration kind of strange. But the fact of the matter is, if you're doing drug trafficking, for example, think about the amount of territory that drugs have to travel to go through Asia, through Russia, to Europe. That requires a lot of handoffs. So you're going to use people that have expertise in those areas.
You met Esther? Head of Burmese crime family?
I have established a monastery where I can bring anything I want into this country.
One of the great things that Esther in this scene says, she says, look, I can do whatever I want. I can move things in and out of the country because I have a charity and it works for religious purposes. No one's going to question. Otari Kvantrishvili, he had a charity to benefit the Afghan vets. He could get duty-free, import-export. He moved all kinds of things. And that's exactly what Esther's talking about. In terms of Esther and her charity, that's a really good point. And the collaboration between ethnic groups, that's real. So I give this about a 7.
Hello, hello. You must be Nina.
The boss here in this case is Nina, a woman. And generally speaking, there aren't a lot of women that rise to upper levels of power and influence. There were some that famous for running their own gangs or running their own crews. But by and large, you don't see it that often.
I'm after a particular bit of tech. A weapon you'll not be surprised to hear. And I thought you and your mates at the Kremlin might be able to help.
The other thing that they mention is the Kremlin. So if you have contacts that can get you to the Kremlin, you work those angles, you work those contacts, and see if you can get access. That's what this game is. If you see the house that this guy is in, that's totally legit. They've built castles, they've built palaces, they've got money they don't know what to do with. And if you were underworld or military or top politician, you had access to that money. One of the people that's kind of made fun of for all his palaces is Vladimir Putin, most of which he never lives in, all over the country. I would give this clip about an 8, which is actually higher than I thought I would give them. But if you think about the Kremlin, all those relationships, that's pretty legit.
Wait a minute.
As we see in this scene, the Russian mafia, the gangsters, they come in and they mess around with Tony's sister. Would they do that in real life? And the answer is definitely yes. A lot of times there isn't a line, and they would just do whatever they had to do at the time they had to do it. One thing about the Russian mafia, the so-called Russian mafia and TV shows, and a lot of people will say, oh, the Italians will kill you, but the Russians will kill you and your family. So this idea about who's worst and who's violent and they're all violent. And if they need to be bloody, they'll be bloody. And if they can get the money they're looking for without being violent, then they won't be violent. It's business. That's all this is.
There's $250,000 there, my own personal funds.
I'll send it to Moscow.
Here you see another example of cooperation, collaboration between, in this case, Russians and Italian Americans. When the Russians came to the United States, they worked, for example, with the Italians in the New York area. New York, New Jersey, they were running massive frauds off of gas excise taxes. It's probably a 6, 7 out of 10.
I'm here for that girl. I can give you $9,800.
For what?
Her freedom.
In this scene, Denzel's character is coming into the hangout, the headquarters of this crew at this strip club to purchase a sex worker, someone he's befriended, to get her out of the game. The Russian mafia makes countless. They make more than $1 billion off of human trafficking. And to come in and offer $9,800 for one woman, they're going to make more money than that off of her in the history of her working. Number 2, he can't let her go because of power and influence and all that game. I love movies like this. I love The Equalizer, shoot him up, kill him up, whatever kind of movies. So the fight scene is totally ridiculous. But he's Denzel Washington and he's the Equalizer, so that's what he's got to do. This scene is mostly unrealistic. It has a couple of moments that's pretty typical of Russian mafia. I give it about a 5. First of all, Bob Odenkirk and his character would never gain access to that money. Right? There'd be so much security around it. The key thing in this scene is that word, obshak. The only thing that Russian in this clip says is obshak. And so obshak is short for obshaya kassa. Obshaya kassa in Russian is common fund. It's like general fund. Obshak was central to Russian mafia, and they would have their money stored in offices, in warehouses, but very quickly they just put it in banks. Russian mafia would buy banks, control banks, but to have stacks and stacks and piles of money, those stacks were nothing. You'd have huge blocks, 3, 4, 6 feet tall. I knew this one guy who was in control of obshak. It was more than $200 million just from one person in one group. If you're talking about a minimum of 500, 1,000 major groups across the country that were networked across Russia and around the world. This chase scene is not really typical. Usually shootouts happen stationary. They might shoot at a car, but the chase scenes, not so much. The upshock is important. It's devastating to have your cash all burnt up. This scene generally, about a 4.
Growing up in Little Odessa, murder was an everyday part of life. Russian mobsters had also migrated from the Soviet Union.
I love this scene from Lord of War. Nicolas Cage's character is narrating kind of his life and his introduction to Russian Mafia. Number one, it's in Brighton Beach. And starting in the 70s, Brighton Beach was the Russian Mafia location. When Russian criminals moved from the Soviet Union, Brighton Beach was the first place to come because they knew other Russians here. And it was places like Brighton Beach where they just grew out from there. And very quickly, they fanned out across the country. So that part about killing people, like that whole scene is 100% legit. Extortion was probably the biggest thing that they did with all those stores and those shops of innocent Russians. They threatened store owners, they collected extortion funds, they killed rivals. So for personal reasons, this is a great clip too. My supervisor in Moscow, when I was working with the National Police, was the Deputy Chief of Organized Crime Control for the entire Soviet Union. And he said to me, tell your FBI, tell your CIA that our Russian Mafia problem is going to become your Russian Mafia problem. This is 1990, before the Soviet Union even collapsed.
I realized my destiny lay in fulfilling another basic human need.
The new Uzi machine pistol. This little baby uses 9mm hollow points.
When Nicolas Cage then does the weapons deal, he saw with his own 2 eyes what's possible and saw a niche, and he's going to fill that niche. And that's all fine, that's all good. But he did that deal in just some room. Back in Moscow, one of the places that was used for arms deals a lot was hotels, because the gangs controlled the hotels. I would rate this pretty high. The Russian influence from the former Soviet Union coming to the United States, setting up in Brighton Beach, it's all legit, 100%, 9 out of 10.
Да он же бывший чеченский террорист. Они тоже из Москвы в Питер двинули. Взял, теперь русских душат.
Love this clip, love the movie, and obviously it's different than all the others. It's in Russia. It's in Russian. The dialogue at the beginning in the car, you see exactly what the dynamics were in the late 80s, early 90s in Moscow, as the groups were struggling for territory. This is St. Petersburg. We saw it in Moscow. We saw it in every major city. The Chechens against the Russians. Each side trying to squeeze out the others. They're trying to take control of the market. The market obviously is a source of extortion money. They're going to extort every one of those kiosks, but also they can move drugs through those. Also, they can run counterfeit products through those kiosks. This is almost a documentary. It's what it looked like and smelled like and felt like in most of the 90s. Nothing really sophisticated. They don't have automatic weapons. They're just using pistols. Sergei, the actor, is in disguise. He just is blending in with the crowd, right? He's just a pair of glasses, a little hat, and he's good to go. You see the boss, the crime boss, is walking through the marketplace. I saw that on a daily basis. You'd have the boss of the market sitting in a corner with just tons of money. It feels so normal. To me, it feels like Moscow. It feels like Russia. It felt like 90s mafia activity. Great movie. The language is great. The atmosphere is great. The attitudes are all great. It just felt like legit 100%. 10 out of 10 rating on this.
Who the hell's Bushmaster?
A Bushmaster is a breed of snake. Our former boss. And head of the Parliamentary Subcommittee for Trade and Finance, Aubrey Longrig.
The major driver behind this movie is the relationship and the machinations between a large Russian money launderer and UK officials, politicians, intelligence community. But the fact of the matter is that this is highly dangerous. And if you look at the money laundering and just look at the scandal of the Bank of New York in 1999, Semion Mogilevich, when you look at Semion Mogilevich, he's been involved and he's a friend of Putin's and he's protected by Putin. And when I was the director of the Moscow office of the world's leading corporate investigation and business intelligence firm, I realized that all of our biggest cases were somehow tied to Semion Mogilevich. Bribing officials, human trafficking, smuggling weapons, drug trafficking, the Bank of New York scandal. There's the whole package right there. And you start to see a little bit of the game that gets played and how complex it is and how many people are involved.
The purpose of this bank? To launder billions of dollars of Russian mafia money here in London.
Nice to see you again, Emilio.
My colleague, Mr. Petrov.
So this piece is the most dangerous and the scariest clip you've shown me. In this clip, the big issue is to what extent have Western politicians been corrupted by the massive amount of money that the Russians have? And the short answer is, maybe nobody wants to hear this, but there's so much money. There's so much corruption across Europe, the United States, due to Russian mafia money, Russian government money. There have been top law enforcement officials in the US who retired and then went to work for Russian oligarchs, which on the surface of it may not be anything, but it doesn't look good, it doesn't smell good. We can talk about blood and we can talk about guns and we can talk about knives. But the scariest clip is when the politicians start taking lots of money and being influenced. It's no surprise that Russia has a huge interest in destabilizing the West. It's been going on forever, and especially under the current regime, they're trying their best to undermine, take advantage of any weaknesses in the European bloc and in the United States to undermine democracy. Obviously, on the face of it, it doesn't look like a scary clip, but for the fear factor, I got to give this like a 9 out of 10. My favorite Russian mafia show was a series on Russian television called Brigada. It was just such a good feel across a 10-year period of what the place felt like, what the Russian mafia really feels like. It's just human beings trying to figure out a way, and they happen to do it in a lot of cases in a brutal manner, but it's nuanced enough to get a feel for the human angle of it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, why not click on the next video?